Hello, everyone. I'm Patrina Gentile, and I've been writing for the Globe Drive section of the Globe and Mail since 2003. I also report regularly on the automotive beat for CTV News Channel, CP24, CHCH TV, and BNN Bloomberg. And I'm delighted to welcome you to our annual Mobility Summit and to moderate the first discussion. If you have any questions for our speakers, or if you have any technical issues, please let us know just by adding it to the chat box at the bottom of your screen. Now, over the course of the afternoon, we'll be having conversations about how we move around in our cities and towns. The pandemic is certainly changing our habits around driving and public transit use. It has also accelerated the development of bike lanes and pedestrian-friendly zones. At the same time, we're seeing a shift to electric vehicles and a push for transportation overall to become more sustainable and cleaner. The question now is, how will transportation and mobility continue to evolve in view of all these changes? To provide us with an overview on the bigger picture is our first guest. Please welcome Matti Semiotic. He's an associate professor with the Department of Geography and Planning at the University of Toronto. Welcome, Matti.
Hi, Patrina. It's nice to be with you.
Thanks for joining us. I know we spoke recently and we talked about the future of mobility hanging in the balance. What does that actually mean? And are we really at a critical crossroads in mobility now?
There are some big questions when it comes to mobility, and the future is very much up for grabs. I would say in two key ways. One is around the recovery from the pandemic. The pandemic really reshaped how people move around our cities and the types of modes and even where they're going. Pre-pandemic, transit was on the ascendance. People were using public transit a lot more. When the pandemic hit, there was a significant impact on public transit. Public transit in the first wave of the pandemic in Canada dropped by around 90%. So a really significant decline. And public transit has started to return, but in many places, it's still been slow and is around 50 to 60% back. And it hovers and wavers depending on where we are in terms of lockdown. So one question is about public transit. And in the intervening period, car-based mobility, even as more people are working from home, car-based mobility has really picked up. So one question is, are we in for a car-based recovery, which will have very significant implications? We've also seen through the pandemic that there was an expansion of bicycle lanes and many more people walking. So active transportation is playing a bigger role in our cities. Driving is also playing a bigger role, and public transit took a big hit. So one question at the macro scale is, what type of recovery are we going to experience as we come out of the pandemic? The second big open question is around the modes of transport, is around technology. What types of technologies are we going to be using going forward? There was a lot of hype around electric vehicles. There's been a lot of hype around auto sharing and ride sharing, and also autonomous vehicles. And we seem to be in a bit of a trough of disillusionment if you think about the innovation cycle, that people are starting to pull back at least from some of these technologies, and especially autonomous vehicles, and starting to think, are we ever really going to get to fully autonomous travel? There was so much hype and excitement and enthusiasm around autonomous vehicles, and that has really started to waver in the short term. So these are some of the dynamics that we're facing. These are some of the tension points, the fault lines that are going to define mobility over the next number of years.
Well, when you talk about the car-based society, I mean, certainly people are buying more cars and using them, but that leads also to greater gridlock, more GHG emissions, greater pollution, more accidents. Do you want to expand on that?
You nailed it. I mean, the car, I think we have to be clear. The car has provided huge opportunities for people. It allows people to get around, and it has very much structured the way our cities are built to date, especially around suburbanization. In Canada, around 2/3 of the population lives in something that could be characterized as a suburban community, many of which are highly auto-oriented. So the car has been important But the car also comes with these real negative externalities and consequences of the way we've built our cities around congestion, around pollution for sure, around eating into the green belt and into fertile farmland. So it has a big impact that way. Then in terms of air pollution emissions and climate change, it's huge. Also for those who can't drive, either because they can't afford to have a car or for other reasons, they can be completely excluded from getting around and from all of the aspects of daily life. So there really are these trade-offs. And what we've learned in recent decades is that cities built around walking and public transit provide a really rich opportunity to create an inclusive and green and vibrant economy and society. So you're starting to see communities really being rebuilt around active transportation, around public transit, and trying to give people real alternatives where the car is part of and provides one option, but is not the only choice. Where we are today, where many of our communities are really auto-oriented, and without a car, they would be very hard places to live.
Oh, absolutely, yes. But it's interesting, you talked also about bike lanes as well. I mean, in Toronto, it was a discussion for decades and decades. And then all of a sudden during the pandemic, these bike lanes popped up in a matter of months.
This was one of the offshoots of the pandemic, that bike lanes that had been on the drawing board for decades, that had been so slow, and that we were going to debate another decade. If you think about Danforth in Toronto, there were plans for bike lanes in this part of the city for literally 2 decades, and we were about to go into a lengthy debate about those bike lanes. And almost overnight with the pandemic, there was a shift in policy and a shift in attitude in communities, that people recognized they were going to need alternatives to get around. And bicycle lanes came very quickly. And in the span of a few weeks and months, with very little controversy, actually, cycle lanes where we were going to gear up for major debates all of a sudden got implemented very quickly. So, and this is a pattern that you're seeing in cities around the world and in our cities here too. So there is a growing appetite for greater walkability and better facilities, pedestrian facilities to encourage walking, and for greater facilities to encourage cycling. And this is happening, but this is happening at the same time as you're also seeing a lot more auto infrastructure being proposed. So in this region, you also have proposals for major highways like Highway 413, the Bradford Bypass. These types of investments will lock in auto-oriented driving patterns and future development that will make it much harder to retrofit later on with cycling and public transit accessibility and community types of development later on.
Well, yeah, you mentioned, in Ontario earlier this week, the government decided to scrap the local transit fares for Go riders. They've offered discounts for Presto, for students. Is this, the right move to try to encourage more people to get back and increase that ridership?
Absolutely. Transit both needs to be convenient and it needs to be affordable. And targeting these areas of interchange and crossing municipal boundaries that are so frustrating for transit riders. I mean, they don't care if they're riding on Go Transit or Mississauga Transit. It's all transit. And the fare coordination and the service coordination has been just an area of deep frustration. So this is a good move. I should also mention that this is being implemented in the run-up to an election, and it's targeted
Yes.
at the 905 region. You'll note that the City of Toronto and the TTC, which is the biggest transit system in this region, in Greater Toronto, was not included in that deal. And it's the 905 region that is really vote rich, and where this government is going to contest this election, and it's going to determine which way it goes. So it's not lost on people that this was both a savvy policy move and also perhaps savvy politics as well.
And I mean, Toronto really has taken a hit, an economic hit from the reduced ridership. I think the C.D. Howe Institute estimates the loss at 1.7 billion in Toronto alone. I mean, if I were a transportation manager in Toronto, what would you tell me?
Well, the first thing is the impact has been staggering, and the federal and provincial governments have both come to the table with financial support to keep these systems operational. So transit fare operations have generally been funded through the fare box and through municipal revenues historically in this region and in much of Canada. And with the pandemic, fare revenue was decimated. And the province and the federal government came forward very quickly with support packages to make sure that these systems would continue to operate. They recognized that these are lifeline services for people getting around during a pandemic, and they had to keep running them. So we've actually seen a reshuffling of the deck and an encouragement of the federal government in particular, as well as the province, to come to the table with real operating money. This could be a renewed opportunity for a three-level government collaboration where we haven't often seen those in the past. We've often seen tensions between the different levels of government when it comes to public transit around who's going to pay, especially for operating costs. And so this could be the start of a real transformation as we come out of the pandemic and start to rebuild around public transit, around walking and cycling as well. And the government, the federal government and province, have brought into place programs to provide those types of investments for those types of infrastructure as well.
But how do we keep the public safe? When it comes to public transit, they are certainly facing, more costs for deep cleaning and the lower ridership that you mentioned. How do we keep them safe?
Well, this was the risk of the transit death spiral, where costs are going up, fare revenue is plummeting, ridership is plummeting, and we were at big risk of cuts. And that's why the investment from the federal government and the province to provide this support for operating was so important, because it gave them the revenue to continue to invest in deep cleaning, to make sure that they had enough service. Even through the pandemic, especially in the inner suburbs, you started to see routes, especially on buses, that continued to be crowded. They continued to have heavy passenger traffic on them as people were going, especially to frontline jobs. Part of the way you keep people safe is by providing enough service so that they can continue to get around, so that that you're not getting overcrowding. So you need service, you need deep cleaning. Those are two key areas. And you need to provide walking and cycling alternatives so that people who don't want to necessarily take public transit for short trips, they have other alternatives there as well. And it's thinking about transportation as an integrated network and providing the right type of mobility for the type of trip, so that people don't either default to the car or feel like they're unable to get around.
I also want to talk a little bit about, freight and moving goods, because, we have people working at home during the pandemic. We have them buying lots of items online. We see the delivery vans, coming in the neighborhood. How does freight come into account when moving goods?
Freight is so important. I mean, everything, it's trite to say at this point, but everything in your daily life got to you somehow, and it probably got to you on a truck. Right. So those trucks are coming, and increasingly they're coming into neighborhoods. They're not just stopping at stores and then we go pick things up. It's now being delivered to us. And so in that regard, and then there's also the business models with folks like Amazon and others who are bringing it and trying to get it there faster. So we have to be thinking about how freight gets delivered. We have to be thinking about what times of day, and where the drop-off points are. So there's all these different ways of thinking now about freight. We also have to be thinking about freight workers. I mean, the things that come to us that we want instantaneously, someone has to take that from a warehouse, put it on a truck, and then that truck has to get to us. And how those workers are employed, under what conditions, what labor rights they have, and what safety conditions. I mean, many of the worst COVID outbreaks were actually in warehouses. And so this just speaks to the stuff that comes to us. For those of us who have been privileged enough to be able to work from home and feel like we're safe in our homes, that's because someone else was out doing the dirty work and making sure that things could get to us. And I think we have to recognize and create safety parameters and programs and policies, laws, so that people are kept safe as freight continues to move and we get all the goods and services that we need.
Okay, we only have a few minutes left. I can't believe how quickly it goes. So I want to get to some audience questions. And one of them, Maddie, is about public transit. What is it going to look like in rural areas? Is it coming to rural areas?
Yeah, rural areas, they have a challenge with public transit because the density is not there. And so transit, it's called mass transit for a reason. It relies on moving large numbers of people in order to be convenient and to cover the costs. We're seeing new models coming forward for rural transit. Some of it is on demand. So it's dial a service. And that's been operating for a long time, but there are new models and new technologies that are to enable scheduling, so that the buses don't travel on a fixed route. They can be much more dynamic. The other option is smaller vehicles. We tend to think of like a 60-foot bus trundling down the street, and public transit, the types of vehicles can actually look quite different. And I think there's some innovation coming there as well. So in rural areas, we are going to start to see different types of services as people look and continue to need to move around, and so that they avoid being isolated.
Okay. And I have another question. What's happening outside of Toronto in other big cities across Canada?
This is what I mean by we're at a real tipping point, or a point of inflection, because across the country, even though the pandemic has decimated public transit, you're actually seeing one of the biggest building booms in public transit infrastructure in the history of our country. And you're seeing that right across Canada. I think that's what's so interesting. Vancouver is gearing up for major transit building. Calgary is in the midst of it. Edmonton has had plans and programs underway. Ottawa just recently completed public transit. Here in Toronto, there's numerous lines being planned and more going under construction. Same in Montreal with the REM project. So this and now Hamilton with their LRT being proposed and moving forward. So much infrastructure is being built. And I think that's why this question of how are we going to come out of the pandemic is so important, because the alternative is this car-based recovery, where people will stick with the trends that they came to during the pandemic, which was to drive more. It's partly because of convenience, partly because their daily travel patterns changed, and partly because of fear of the virus during the pandemic. So, there's all these transitions, but I think we have to stick to what we know will lead to a brighter future, which is this transit-oriented infrastructure, plus building the types of complete communities where people can live, work, and play around the stations. And that will be an approach that you're starting to see across the country that I think will bear fruit in building more livable cities.
What about, I know you talked a little bit about autonomous vehicles. There was a lot of hype in it, and it may not be as around the corner as we think. But what about, autonomous shuttles? We certainly see a lot of projects in Quebec, in Calgary, in Ontario as well. Is that, a realistic mode of transportation?
There was a huge amount of hype about autonomous shuttles. And, when people think about autonomous vehicles, they often think of the Tesla on autopilot mode. But actually, in many cases, people thought the first mover would really be these shuttles traveling on kind of fixed loops. And more recently, here in Ontario, there was a shuttle pilot in Whitby, and it actually had an accident. That the vehicle itself, apparently, by all accounts, wasn't under autonomous travel at the time, but it had an accident, and the pilot has now been canceled. And the city of Toronto was going to start a similar pilot, and they canceled it too. So these really do face the real risk that if there's any safety concerns, it can scuttle the entire sector. So I think there's been a step back. I mean, I think if we were having this conversation in 2015, 2016, there was a sense that autonomous vehicles were a year away, and that we were all going to be in the Jetsons world very soon. And now I think we've entered into this like more realistic view, and it kind of feels like autonomous vehicles, like full autonomous vehicles, are now kind of like 2 years away from being 2 years away, or 3 years or 5 years away from being 5 years away. Like the horizon is being pushed off further and further. And I think it's because we've recognized that both the technological challenges to really make this work and make it safe are profound, but also the social transformation of what it's going to be like to live in that type of community, and who really wins and who the winners and the losers are is becoming clearer. And I think we're starting to have more of those debates about how this technology, if it actually can get up to speed, is really going to integrate into the communities that we're building.
Oh, that was excellent. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. I could go on with you for another hour. This is great. Thank you so much, Maddie. I really appreciate it. And thank you to our great questions from our audience as well. I'd like to now turn it over to our Globe Drive editor, Jordan Chitley, for our next discussion. Welcome, Jordan.
Thanks so much, Patrina. That was a really interesting discussion. I'm Jordan Chitley, editor of Globe Drive with the Globe and Mail, and I'm pleased to be moderating our next panel today, which is focused on the shift to cleaner vehicles. The springboard for this discussion is Canada's commitment to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. And as part of that goal, the country's pledged to ban the sale of fuel-burning new cars and light-duty trucks from 2035. This isn't a lot of time, and the automotive industry and the energy sector will need to work together to accommodate the shift to electric and alternative fuel vehicles. We have a great group here today to talk about that. So let's bring in our panelists. Joining us today is Brandy Giannetta, Vice President of Policy, Regulatory and Government Affairs with the Canadian Renewable Energy Association. Next, we have Mike Buff, Senior Manager of Product and Programs with Electrify Canada. Also joining us is Scott McKenzie, Senior National Manager of External Affairs with Toyota Motor Manufacturing Canada. And finally, we have Carolyn Kim, Director of Transportation with the Pembina Institute. Welcome, everyone.
Hello.
Hello.
Glad to be here.
I'd like to start today with a bit of a lightning round that's sort of going to frame our discussion going here. So just quickly, yes or no, will Canada make its 2035 goal? Like, are we on pace? Brandy.
Can I say yeah, but more to come on that?
Complicating it already. Mike, what do you say?
If you want big results, you have to have big ambitions.
So far, 2 people, and no one has provided a yes or a no. All right, Scott.
Resounding maybe. I think we could get there in transportation, assuming we have a plan in place to do that. But, for carbon reduction across all of the different sectors, I haven't seen a plan that'll get us there yet.
And Carolyn.
I'm an optimist, Jordan, but my short answer is no.
All right, thanks. Next, in just a few quick words, what is the biggest barrier to us reaching that 2035 goal? Brandy, let's start with you again.
Yeah, this is where the but comes in. So we really need a rapid decarbonization and expansion of our clean electricity production in order to achieve those goals. So yeah, we can do it, but we also have to clean the grid and grow the grid with clean power in order to get there.
Thanks. Mike, what do you think is our biggest barrier?
Yeah, so we see the biggest barriers as consumer awareness and consumer confidence. And so we've really focused on the expansion of our fast charging network, as well as our efforts in the community on education to really help drive, to raise EV awareness and break down those barriers.
Thanks. Scott.
Biggest challenge, I think, is going to be cost. And, Mike talked about earlier in his comment about, having to be ambitious. And I agree with that. But we need a plan really to get there. So I think there's a lot of ambition and even commitment, but I haven't seen a comprehensive plan across any sector really that's going to deliver the results that we need.
And finally, Carolyn, what do you say?
Jordan, I think we have the technology, the know-how, the expertise in Canada to achieve that goal. But the biggest barrier is building the momentum and the inertia for change. It's very difficult to change people's behavior and move away from how we've always done things. So I think, yes, it's cost, it's infrastructure, it's figuring all those things out, like how do we get to net zero grid? But we need to have a change in mindset first.
Thanks, everyone. It sounds like we have a lot of big issues to tackle. But first, I want to start with the electricity itself. Brandy, I know this is a question that probably deserves a very in-depth answer. Fortunately, we don't have a ton of time, but can you give us a brief overview of what is actually going to have to change on the grid from now until 2035 or even 2050 if we're going to meet these goals?
Yeah, sure. And you're right. There is a comprehensive, planning and consideration to factor into the electricity side alone. But very quickly, Canada actually put out quite a comprehensive plan, the Canada 2050 vision late last fall. So there are comprehensive plans out there, and folks have visions and ambitious goals. But in a brief, I say, explanation of how we get there and what we need to do on the electricity side in particular to get to 2050 is 5 top things I'll highlight. So rapid decarbonization of the grid, and growing our quantity of clean electricity production to support the net zero ambitions. Wind and solar need to be a big part of that. And we need to modernize our electricity markets, our regulatory structure. So breaking down barriers on the regulatory side. We've got to diversify how we build this power. So it's not just big, large grid connected assets. We're going to need to really get innovative and enable technology on the distribution side, rooftop solar. So everybody should have rooftop solar panels on their houses, and businesses should do the same. We've got to prioritize new approaches to transmission. So we've got to enable these resources to connect to the end user. And then finally, as a fifth to do, if you will, we need to make sure that we're continuing to drive that momentum on building out, so defining and then enabling comprehensive electrification strategies. And that includes green hydrogen strategies as well. So it is comprehensive. So those are sort of the top 5 bullet points of what to do. And we can break it down in future conversations for sure.
Thanks. And now I want to move quickly. So if, let's say, we are producing enough electricity, we are still going to need a place to charge the cars. And this is where I wanted to ask Mike specifically. A lot of people, when they consider an EV, are a bit hesitant because of lack of range and slow charging times. So what is the vision for charging stations? I'm guessing it isn't just to simply replace gas nozzles with charging cords.
Yeah, that's right. So our vision here is to make charging so ubiquitous that we both remove any range considerations as well as charging speed considerations from the equation. We've really focused on 4 things that customers tell us that they want. One is ultra fast charging. The second is convenient locations. The third is technology, and the fourth is around creature comforts. On the ultra fast side, so today we have 30 ultra-fast charging stations across Canada. We're building towards 100 of those locations and 500 dispensers by 2026. When we say ultra-fast, that means 350 kilowatts, or basically, for a capable car, being able to charge 30 kilometers per minute of charging. So you pull in, go in, grab a cup of coffee, come back out, get back on the road. We see that as a game changer. And finally, both the charging is here and the vehicles are on their way to make that happen. On the convenience side, as I mentioned, we're building out our network. We are looking to build a cross-country network all the way from Halifax in Nova Scotia over to Victoria, British Columbia, as well as adding density in major metro areas. The focus for us is really fitting charging into your lifestyle. So while you're going to the grocery store, while you're going out shopping, being able to fit that charging into activities that you're already doing. We're hyper-focused on technology. So as I mentioned, the ultra-fast charging is something that we've really helped pioneer. We're also pioneering a technology called Plug and Charge, which is a payment technology, which allows drivers to simply pull up, plug in their vehicle, and without pulling out their wallet, smartphone, or any sort of payment system, vehicle and the charger talk to each other and authenticate, and you're able to get on your way. And then lastly, we focus on creature comforts. So 24/7 access. We want every time you pull in, you've got access to bathrooms, you've got access to food, lighting. We're putting canopies at a large number of our sites across Canada to help with the weather elements. So really making the charging experience a comfortable one. So we think, as we continue to build out our network, this is going to help both unlock adoption and also, as I mentioned at the outset, really remove a number of these barriers from the equation for vehicle buyers.
So is this a situation where a lot of the gas stations, like we won't see them on so many of the corners? A lot of people will be charging at home. People who may not be able to charge at home are using the urban network. And then if you go to town, also have access to those stations, and maybe charging when, I don't know, you're running in to get groceries or something. Is that what you see?
Yeah. So what's interesting with charging an electric vehicle, which is a little different than fueling up your gas car, is that we have an ability to site charging stations virtually anywhere, right? You don't have the same level of permitting restrictions around hazardous materials. So we do see the growth, and we're really looking to site our stations, as you mentioned, grocery store, major retailers, shopping malls, trying to fit that in when you're charging out and about, trying to fit that into your daily life, as opposed to pulling off the road and having to stop at a petrol station here or there.
If I may
Thanks.
just add to that, just
Yeah.
a comparative a scenario. If you can picture that there's 12,000 gas stations across Canada, there are less than 5,000 chargers in Canada. And 1/3 of Canadians live in multi-unit residential buildings or don't have garages. So if you can think about the kinds of infrastructure build out that we need to get to, that kind of gives you a sense of how far behind we are.
Those are some really interesting stats, Carolyn. Are there other countries, like while you bring it up, are there other countries that we should be looking to if you mentioned that we are really far behind? Go ahead, Carolyn.
I think that when you compare ourselves to others in North America, in Europe, we're seeing that heavy investments in the electric vehicle infrastructure. And so that's going to help their jurisdictions kind of grow and expand their adoption. And as my fellow panelists have mentioned, one of the key barriers to adoption is access to charging infrastructure and helping consumers understand how to easily navigate maintenance and access to charging so that they can visit family, friends, go to Algonquin for that canoe trip. So that's the stretch goal here.
While we're talking about access, I just wanted to ask, and maybe Mike is a good place to start with this one. What is the role of government in providing access to these stations? Is government going to have to provide some massive, I guess, sort of incentives to companies like yours or to consumers to aid with adoption here, like outside from the incentives for the actual vehicles?
Yeah, so it's a great question. We see a role for government engagement on this ambitious goal at a number of different levels, right? So it starts with incentives on the price of the vehicles themselves. Those are certainly dropping and dropping quickly, but as an area where the government can help spur adoption, that's a good starting point. Support for those who are looking to install charging in their homes, right? So for the 2/3 of Canadians that Carolyn mentioned that can put charging in their homes, this is often the most cost-effective place to charge, and so there's an opportunity for support there. And then when we think about the public charging side for that remaining third, initiatives, it comes to a few things. One, initiatives to support the local businesses becoming site hosts. Efforts to make permitting easier. So it's not just money. In many respects, permitting can create challenges and additional cost in installing stations. And so any efforts to alleviate permitting challenges and streamline those processes can be really helpful. And then the last one is around electric rate reform. So what customers want when we go out and talk to them, they're looking for ultra fast charging like we're providing. The challenge is that electric rates include demand charges, which can be, without going into sort of all of the details there, which can be a real challenge to the local site economics and a driver of cost. And so we see a big opportunity for rate reform there as well that will help drive down the cost of charging for everyone.
Thanks, Mike. Scott, I want to bring you in now as the automotive representative on our panel today. How are companies like Toyota preparing for the transition? And I want to start specifically with light vehicles. And what is the role for other fuels right now?
Sure. Honestly, we started, our evolution into this space more than 20 years ago by, introducing hybrids into the marketplace. And, you're seeing plug-in hybrids and battery electric vehicles, increasing in adoption. And then, outside of that, you've also got hydrogen. So we have hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles in the marketplace now. We've got companies, including ours, looking at hydrogen combustion. And then you'll even see, especially in certain markets across the world, but maybe in Canada as well, you might see the introduction of e-fuels, which could be paired with things like a hybrid engine to, facilitate emissions reduction across many different technologies.
Scott, I just want to stay with you for a second on the hydrogen powered. As like Toyota made a big splash with the Mirai, but as far as I know it, now it's in North America anyways, it's only sold in California, right?
We sell the Mirai in Quebec and British Columbia as well in Canada. Okay. But the challenge with hydrogen is it's always attached to infrastructure. And I know Mike spent some time talking about electric charging infrastructure, but hydrogen filling infrastructure is generally more capital intensive and harder to put in place. We could talk about the merits of hydrogen versus, other technologies maybe in some other time, but, hydrogen has a role to play, especially in things like, heavy freight or even mass transit applications. It also has a lot of merit, for light duty vehicles. And but the challenge is always going to be that infrastructure. So wherever you have filling stations, I think hydrogen has a role to play. But then you get into a discussion of, a chicken or egg type scenario where, you need the available market in order to justify the filling infrastructure, or you need to have the filling infrastructure to justify bringing, vehicles into the marketplace.
So is Toyota working to have more of these filling stations for the light duty hydrogen vehicles, or do you see it more of playing a bigger role right now in freight? Because not a lot of other automakers are really pursuing hydrogen. A lot of them are going for the fully electric vehicles.
There's quite a few other automotive OEMs who also have hydrogen applications, but generally we try to partner with other interests, whether it would be governments or other private enterprises, just because the capital costs of bringing in hydrogen stations is very high. If you look at Canada, I'm not sure what the actual number is now in terms of filling stations that are in operation, but it's less than 10. You look at California, it's more than 50. You look at places like Germany, I think they've got over 100 now. So it is possible, but you just have to have a plan to get there.
Thanks. I want to sort of transition to freight vehicles now. Transportation is about a quarter of our greenhouse gas emissions, but a lot of that isn't us actually driving our cars. A lot of that is freight, and obviously during the pandemic, with the increase of online shopping, I guess my question is, and I want to start with Carolyn here, what role is freight and heavy duty vehicles going to have to play in us meeting the 2035 and even the 2050 goal?
You're absolutely right, Jordan. Freight is a really big piece to the puzzle. And as we heard from the previous session from Maddie, we need to drive down our freight emissions. And let me give you some stats to consider. Freight emissions are steadily rising and are expected to surpass passenger emissions by 2030. And it's one of the hardest sectors to decarbonize for a number of reasons. Number one, when you think about the long distances that trucks need to travel to get to consumers, to businesses, our country is quite vast. And so that adds to it. And secondly, the sheer number of trucks that are coming on our road. Every year, there's a 2% increase in the number of vehicles on our road. And when you think about holistically, since 2005, there's been an increase by 57%. So with e-commerce driving online shopping and a reliance on trucks to deliver those goods, we need to be thinking about how we can reduce our vehicle kilometers traveled and the fuel consumption.
Thanks, Carolyn. I want to get to some audience questions in just in a few minutes, but I do want to ask Brandy about costs. If there's a lot more demand on our electricity system, with people being able to access, will people be able to access it at reasonable rates?
It's a great question, Jordan, and genuinely, study after study over the past several years that have come out show consistently that in order to enable that lowest cost pathway, the most reliable, sustainable pathway to net zero in Canada, we're going to need to double the amount of wind energy and solar energy that we currently have in production today. Why wind and solar? Because it remains the lowest cost source of new electricity generation. So there are other technologies that will be required, other sources of electricity generation that will continue to be built out, including energy storage. But as the lowest cost options, all of the modeling across Canada has consistently showing that we need to double down on wind and solar. So we really have to do that. And it's really a matter of scope and scale. So, it's important in that regard because not just are we building new electricity generation at an affordable cost in a sustainable way, we also have to make significant investments in those other forms of electricity generation, energy storage, infrastructure like transmission and distribution connections. So it's a big picture and the scope and scale matters and that will add costs. But we can do it. We're prepared. We have the technology. We have the financial structures in place to do it. We even, for in a very favorable way, we have a strong policy environment as well to support that build out. But as we do that, I think it's also important to acknowledge from an affordability perspective in particular, customers and community support is going to need to be maintained and sustained. And along with that comes economic advantages. So, there's going to be a cost. We're going to do it in the most sustainable and affordable way if we focus on wind and solar in particular, but we also create economic advantages. We've heard a lot about the just transition, and that's a topic for another panel, but we're going to enable economic development and opportunities in communities where we're building these sources of generation, where the end users are drawing on that power at this new scope and scale. So sustainability is a big factor here, and enabling new industry and new employment opportunities, as well as economic benefits for the communities these projects are operating in. So there is a way to balance it. And will there be cost? Absolutely. But I think we can do it in a way that's affordable, and we have the technology and we have the capacity in Canada already to do that.
Mike, do you see the cost? So right now, to charge a Leaf, it probably costs, $3. Whereas to charge my car, it could cost, upwards of $100 right now with gas prices. Like in 10, 20 years, what do you see as being the cost to charge one of the EVs? Let's say a range of about 500 kilometers.
So 10, 20 years is a long way to forecast out. I guess what I could say is, when we think about charging a vehicle, certainly charging at home for those who can is often the most cost-effective solution. You can take advantage of off-peak rates. We when we think about looking out 10 to 20 years, there's a lot of opportunity and synergy between charging your vehicle and the vehicle as a battery and home storage that can then be a grid, that can then sort of augment the grid as necessary. And so we think that there's a really interesting play there, which will help ultimately help make both the vehicle and the grid more affordable, with a whole host of distributed batteries being able to support the grid. On the public side, look, charging is pretty cheap today. We offer prices at our stations as low as 21 cents per minute with a Electrify Canada Pass Plus membership. I won't bore you with the math, but it's already quite competitive versus gasoline. And so, we think that we're in a pretty good place today, and are really excited about where things are headed in the future.
Do you mind if I jump in quick, Jordan?
Yeah, I was actually just going to turn to you. So go for it.
I just, building on what Mike was just saying, I think it's less helpful to think or try and predict what the cost of electricity is going to be in the future and focus on what the cost needs to be. Because, the cost of the actual product and then the cost of, the charging, those are probably the two biggest factors that are going to influence, adoption of battery electric vehicles. And, cost is still, it's the largest input. It's the biggest factor in terms of people's decision making. And I think you're going to hurt the argument around future electrification if electricity is more expensive than, for instance, filling your car up with gas. I don't think that's a likely outcome, but I think that's the way that we need to look at things.
Thanks, everyone. I want to turn to some audience questions now, so I'm just going to read these. What are the opportunities to incentivize owners of multi-unit buildings to include electric chargers? Carolyn, I'm going to start with you, and hopefully you have an answer.
Well, I think, policy and regulation plays a role. And you asked that question earlier. What are the policy drivers? And first, we need to ensure that our buildings are ready to charge vehicles. And that means changing the building codes. It, as Mike mentioned, it requires a change in our permitting system so that we can, rapidly enable condominium owners to get the right systems and standards in place. So I think, policy is a huge driver first and foremost, and that's going to empower, homeowners and those who are living in multi-unit buildings to have access to an electric vehicle.
So
did anyone else want to jump in on that?
Yeah, can I jump in?
Yeah, go for it, Mike.
So I would support everything that was said. I would add make-readies to as new buildings are being constructed, putting in make-readies or the conduit in order to support installation can be really helpful. But I would, maybe stepping back, I would question the premise of it a little bit. What we're seeing on our network is that the more we put charging in urban areas, in places that are heavily populated by multi-unit dwellings, we see those folks both adopting vehicles and then going out and charging those vehicles on a regular basis. As I mentioned at the outset, really as just sort of a part of their day-to-day lives, integrated well into their everyday activities. And so, we would certainly support putting charging in the buildings themselves, but we actually think that there's a faster and in many ways probably more achievable outcome, which is to actually put ultra fast charging in those communities as an alternative.
Mike, I just want to stay with you for a second and go to another audience question. Someone asks, what about charging stations at destinations such as provincial parks, theaters, etc., that folks will want to drive to?
Absolutely. So we support those as well. I think, what's important for us is, as I mentioned earlier, there's a few key elements when we're looking at locations. So we want to make sure there's 24/7 access. So when you show up, you're going to be able to charge. We want to make sure that it's a safe location, and that's really at all times of day. Customers want access to bathrooms. They want access to some sort of amenity while they're there. So a park can be a good one, particularly if there's some sort of food or other refreshments that can be purchased on site. for us, it's really all about making sure that the customer, while they're charging, they're having a great experience and fitting things into their day, and destinations can be a great option for that.
All right, and one more audience question that goes to everybody. Do you see absolutely no use of fossil fuel? Brandy, let's start with you.
Net zero is a bit of a loaded term, Jordan, and it doesn't quite have a clear definition even from our federal government who is driving that objective. And so today, by 2035, no, I don't envision a world where no fossil fuel use will exist in Canada. And by 2050, we might have a different view on that because we'll have a lot of those enablers in place. Electricity remains, in particular where I sit, the perspective I bring to this panel, electricity remains a commodity and a very necessary commodity, and one that will be continue to be motivated by supply and demand. So those very basic metrics in growing our clean electricity supply is the goal here. So the objective is to enable more clean sources of electricity generation to power the broader, deeper electrification of other sectors like transportation and building, et cetera. So I think there is an effort underway to move away, yes, absolutely, from fossil fuel generation. What is that specific date? I think that remains to be seen, and what it looks like also remains to be seen, particularly in cases where we can still have fossil fuel generation for electricity or other end uses and have carbon capture. We can have hydrogen production as well as an output of that. So I think there's a lot of work still to be done to define what that looks like. And I think what I could say as an optimistic outlook insofar as moving away more rapidly and aggressively from fossil fuel dependence and use in general is the push to power our world with clean electricity. So there is, I think, a pathway that we're on. Setting goals and targets is an important part of that. Meeting those goals and targets is an even more important part of that. So there's a lot of work to be done, and we're kind of all in this together, and it's not going to be one sector over another. We're going to have to do it and move along. Like I think Carolyn mentioned at the beginning, starts and stops and policy drivers will continue to be required over time. And we need to all kind of work together and put a collaborative effort forward.
Scott, how would you answer that? Is fossil fuels going to completely go away at some point?
It depends what you're talking about. So if you're talking about North America or even specifically in Canada, it'll be better than some other regions. But even by 2035, when the government's talking about restricting the sale of internal combustion engines, they're still including plug-in hybrid in that case. So maybe longer range plug-in hybrid, because we simply won't have all of the solutions in place by that point in time. And then if you look at heavy freight, we've talked a lot about heavy duty freight and trucking. I don't see a technical solution right now that's going to be in place that would completely eliminate the need for fossil fuels. And then taking a step back with Toyota as a global company, not just looking at Canada, but we operate on every continent. And, we have significant sales in Africa. We have significant sales in Southeast Asia and South America. And, the challenge for decarbonization there is it's different. I don't think you're going to see widespread adoption of completely battery electric vehicles in the near term in those locations. So I think having, our approach, our global approach of having different solutions for every type of customer, I think is the right way to go.
Mike?
Sure. I guess I'll focus on the transportation side of things, which is where Electrify Canada is focused. I think, from our standpoint, we believe that zero emission vehicles are achievable and are coming quickly. And then, as we think about how do we go about fueling them, we are very much focused on fueling them with 100% clean electricity. So we're out there today working on figuring out exactly how to ensure that every kilowatt hour delivered through our sites is going to be clean. So from our standpoint, we think that element of it is achievable, and we're certainly interested in driving it forward, investing where we need to in order to make sure that all of the fueling we're doing will be clean.
And Carolyn?
I think what I will add is that when we look at the bigger picture, climate scientists have said that 1.5 degrees is the safe limit to global warming. And so we need to drive down our emissions by 45% by 2030 and to reach net zero by 2050. So that is going to mean a decline in use of fossil fuels. And the IEA has projected a decline in fossil fuels globally. So when you take a step back, I think what we want at the end of the day is not to electrify cars for the sake of it, but to create healthy, vibrant, sustainable communities. And so that means, number one, electrifying vehicles where you can, but also creating, the communities that will enable alternative transportation modes, active transportation, cycling, walking, public transit. Those are all drivers for decarbonizing the transportation sector.
Thanks, everyone. And Carolyn, you bring up a great point, and I want to stay with you for a minute because it seems like our goal in all of this with the 2035 target and the 2050 target, it's not to electrify everything. It's to actually make us have a cleaner planet to live on. So I guess my question's a bit open, but Carolyn, like if we, and you sort of alluded to it already, but if we swap all the gas cars for the electric cars, are we going to meet this net zero goal that we have? Like, is it actually going to help, or what are the other steps that we have to take to really improve our planet?
Yeah, first I'll say that electrification is a huge component to decarbonization. And so we do need to accelerate the adoption of EVs. Canada has established a target for 100% of new car sales will be electric by 2035. When it comes to medium and heavy duty vehicles, Canada has committed to achieving 100% by 2040. So we know that that's a big piece, but you're absolutely right. As I mentioned, it's going to take more than that. And one of the speakers in the previous session talked about how cities have really built out their cycling network. And why don't we build upon that, not just use cycling networks for personal enjoyment or for commuting, but how can we use that for delivering goods? That's a really great way of capitalizing on our investments. When you think of the Amazon packages that you're getting every single day, why not use cargo electric bikes for that last mile delivery? So I think there's a number of ways in which consumers can, reduce their carbon footprint, especially through shipping of goods. You can choose slower delivery modes, for example, and that's going to allow companies to optimize their delivery routes and, again, reduce their carbon footprint. So these are the kinds of options that need to be available for Canadians.
We do have two other great panels coming up right after this that are going to discuss a lot more about mobility and city planning. But Brandy, I saw you nodding along when I was asking the question, so feel free to add to that question or the answer.
Yeah, I mean, your question it was a good question, Jordan. It's like, are we going to get there? Is electrifying our vehicles enough? And no, it's not. But it's a big part of the puzzle because along with that, if we are not increasing our supply of electricity as a resource to power that transition, then we're not going to get there. So it's very much a comprehensive strategy. Electrification writ large, as Carolyn said, is required. The transportation fleet alone is not going to do it, particularly not our, the cars that we drive every day as commuters, et cetera. And I know that we've heard already about the larger fleet and tackling that component, but electrification of the broader economy is really the goal. And so it's a big picture view. And because of the hat I'm wearing on this panel, I can't stress enough the need to also increase our clean electricity generation. So we have to, whether it's We need the battery production to power the cars. We also need the electricity generation to power those batteries once they're in those cars and they're on the road. So comprehensive electrification strategy is required. There's no single sort of low-hanging fruit, but there's certainly a lot to be said about, I think, the strides that we could take immediately with EV adoption. And there's certainly a lot to be said about our starting point in Canada as a clean electricity jurisdiction. But there's a lot more to do because we need more electricity. So it has to be clean and it has to keep pace with the electrification targets that we're aiming for. So it's a big picture view.
Thanks, Brandy. We only have 1 minute left, but I want to do very quick final thoughts. Mike, you want to start?
Sure. I guess my final thought is, be on the lookout for our stations. Where, as I mentioned before, we're vastly growing our network. We're going to have a nationwide presence over the next couple of years, and really excited to bring the charging that customers want in order to drive adoption to the whole of Canada.
Scott?
I'm actually optimistic. I think we can get there. It's not an impossible challenge, but as some of the other panelists have commented, we need to take a holistic approach at the problem, which is total carbon, and finding effective solutions to put in place to address that. It's not just transportation; it's everywhere.
Brandy?
Yeah, and there's no time to waste, Jordan. Like, this is an urgent call to action. If we weren't all aware of it, we need to continue to remain aware of it. There's no time to waste. The scope and the scale of the electricity generation, the decarbonization efforts required, that heavy lift. It needs to happen now. It needs to happen faster, and it needs to happen consistently over the course of the next 30 years for us to even be able to presume we'll get to net zero by 2050. So yeah, no time to waste.
And Carolyn?
Just to build off of Brandy's point, the call to action is this: we need a mandate and a strong policy for new car sales, new truck sales to be 100% electric by 2035, 2040. We need a clean electricity standard, and we need a national clean fuel standard to help drive the transition to electric vehicles and zero emission vehicles.
Well, it sounds like from the last 40 minutes, we certainly all have a lot of work to do. And thank you to all of you, and thank you for giving us some really interesting points to think about. Right now, we're going to take a 10-minute break, but please join us at 1:40 for a discussion of the future of public transit and a panel on the 15-minute city. Thanks. Bye.
Good afternoon. Welcome back, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Oliver Moore. I'm a reporter for the Globe and Mail. I write about cities. I write about urban issues. So this stuff is bread and butter to me, and I'm really happy to be here today to talk about the future of transit, and part and parcel of that is the future of transportation. It's a big issue. It's really one of the biggest issues facing cities. It's a pocketbook issue. It's a quality of life issue. It's an environmental issue. And frankly, it gets to the heart of urban viability. Cities don't work. At the very least, they don't work very well unless people can get around with some base level assumption of reliability and safety. And obviously, cities are now grappling with this issue with a lot of our assumptions of the last 2 years upended by the pandemic, assumptions about where we live and where we work and how we get from one to the other and how we get around. There's a lot to talk about today, and I will try to save as much time as I can at the end for audience questions. But in the meantime, I'll bring in our panel. We've got an excellent trio here to talk to. We've got from Metrolinx, the regional transit agency, we've got Carla Avis-Birch. She's the chief planning officer. From UBC, we've got Patrick Condon. He's a professor and the James Taylor Chair of Landscape and Livable Environments. Sorry, Patrick, I kept getting that wrong in the practice. And finally, we have Michael Sutherland from Hatch, the engineering and design consultancy, who is the director of urban solutions. Thank you all for being here today. I really appreciate it. And I will go first to you, Carla. I just alluded to this in my introduction. I mean, obviously, the last 2 years have been a very difficult time for transit. Ridership has plummeted. Revenues have gone down in lockstep. There's been a lot of questions about to the extent to which people will want to use transit in the future. There's been questions about how the service model maybe should evolve and whether capital projects should or shouldn't continue. That's all from the outside. That's people watching us out have seen those questions raised. I was hoping you could paint a picture for us of how it looks on the inside. We're 2 years into the pandemic now. Tell us how's transit doing, and what's in store for transit. What happens next?
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me here today. That's a very big question. I want to say that we're definitely confident in providing a regional transit integrated network that really helps to deliver what people, where they want to go and why they want to go there and where they need to go. Metrolinx is rewiring transit across the Greater Golden Horseshoe to connect communities and people for decades to come. And the work that we're doing, even though the COVID and the pandemic has, put a dent in that, as you mentioned, we've all suffered a plummet in ridership. But at the same time, we continue to be focused on bringing those right products across the region to customers for customer needs. And at the same time, during COVID, we were able to continue building transit. And you will see many shovels in the ground of the work that we're doing today. The Scarborough Subway Extension, we have tunnel boring machines that are out there. The Huron-Ontario LRT out in the west continues to be constructed, and we could go on the list of those projects that are happening. Painting a picture in the future, I think if COVID taught us anything, it's that you can't predict too far. But what we did learn through this pandemic is that we need to adapt. We want to continue to be flexible, and we want to really be receptive and responsive to what customers need. To what the region needs, and really being able to get across the region and really leverage some of the learnings we had around new working habits, working from home, traveling, different travel patterns. So not having the same kind of community that comes early in the morning into the city, and at the end of the evening, we're going back out into our suburbs. There's a lot more midday travel that's happening, which, our service and our Go Expansion program is going to be able to service. But there's a lot of outer boundary connections that are actually happening suburb to suburb, right? And moving across the region, new job opportunities where people are, living, working, and playing. We want to be able to kind of meet that. So while ridership has fallen, we are seeing an uptake in movement. I took the GO train this morning from the east and saw that, the quads are becoming just a little bit more full. And so we continue to kind of build on that recovery. People are coming back, and we are there to meet that challenge and continue to bring innovative solutions to grow and to be able to meet the needs of the region.
Well, thanks, Carly. You're right. That was a very large question. I think from that, we're going to dive down in a whole bunch of different ways throughout the rest of this session. So thank you for kind of setting the table for us. I'm obviously not in my office right now. I'm doing this from home. I think most of the people in the audience are doing this from home. I didn't expect to be working from home 2 years into this. And I accept, as Carla said, we don't know what the future will hold. But given that, Michael, given that we don't know that crystal ball, but what we have seen is that people's patterns are changing. What does this seeming shift, we'll see if it's permanent or not, this seeming shift in how we live and how we work, what does that mean for transit? What does that mean for downtowns? What does that mean, once you layer in online shopping? How much of a factor is this when we look ahead at transit going forward?
Good question, Oliver, and thanks again to the panel, and thanks for the Globe and Mail and Toyota for pulling us all together. The pandemic has changed a lot, and we're just, knock on wood, coming out of it, and hopefully the future will become a lot clearer in the coming months. But I think there's a couple of things worth noting. First of all, the hybrid work from home ability to use technology and team has been a great opportunity for transit agencies, in the way that long-term transit has been built to be big pipes and deliver maximum capacity in the AM and the PM peak, because that's when the systems loads up. And so by flattening the peaks a little bit, that's an opportunity to spread trips around and actually generate better capital utilization. So i.e., in layman's terms, you're not running empty buses and trains at all times of the day. You're sizing the system for a more consistent level of use, which in the end is better from a capital perspective, and it's better from an operating perspective as well. I think the point about the role of downtowns, lots of interesting discussion going on there. I mean, Canada's largest cities in particular that rely on big, heavy transit systems, they're wonderful downtowns. I mean, there's lots that can be said about how they need to be improved. But I mean, if you look at downtown Vancouver, downtown Montreal, downtown Toronto, I mean, these are places where lots of people come together and collaborate every day, and they're face to face. And will there be changes in tenant mix and how people use space and how office buildings are configured? Absolutely. Will these spaces be really attractive places for people to come and work and collaborate and partner and sell things and invent things and innovate? Absolutely. Yes, they will. And so the role for large rail networks in particular, I think, to service those downtowns will come back. The other thing we have in Canada in particular is, especially with the aggressive and open, thankfully, immigration policy that we have, is we have strong growth. We have really strong growth, and so we can continue to augment and provide the transit capacity is necessary to provide the trip patterns that people are going to need. And so, we can have a conversation, as we go on in the panel, I'm sure, about how best to shape that growth and make it as efficient and good for people and carbon neutral as possible. But I'm optimistic. I mean, I think the key thing is we don't have another variant, and we can start getting back to normal. But there's a big push in the corporate world in many quarters to be back in the office, and it may not be the same as before. But again, that capacity that Carla mentioned is being delivered will ultimately be necessary when you consider the factors of the growth of Canada's cities, how they will be used. I think work in the suburbs, I think that's another question, and we can talk about that. And you mentioned retail. I mean, retail is definitely moving to a hybrid model, and I think that's here to stay.
Excellent. Thanks for that. I mean, I think it's interesting that you use the term flatten the peaks. I mean, that's a term I've heard in transit for years, but I think most people started to hear about the concept of flattening the peaks in the context of hospitals and COVID. That I guess you could translate that simply as use the asset as efficiently as possible, as opposed to having tons of people in transit in the morning and afternoon. It's a good way to look at it. But Patrick, I'd like to bring in you now, because you and I have chatted a little bit about this, and I know you feel that transit is sometimes focused too much on downtowns. Tell me a little bit about what that issue is and to what extent COVID allows cities to break out of what may have been a habit rather than a necessity.
Yeah, thanks. And springing off of what Michael has just said, I'll just talk generally in these couple of minutes about the distribution of jobs and housing in our metropolitan regions and the trends in those two key areas. I'll start with an example from the city of Vancouver. City of Vancouver's downtown area, as defined in the regional strategy, only contains 18% of the jobs. Less than 1 in 5 of all the jobs in the region are in the downtown. And that percentage is actually shrinking as the metropolitan area expands largely to the east. And yet our transit system assumes that our major objective is to get people in and out of the downtown. And we tend to reinforce that with our public decisions about transit capital infrastructure. For example, in the city of Vancouver, the decision has been made to reinforce the hub and spoke system that feeds the designated downtown area of the metropolitan region, which is Vancouver Center. So there's kind of a chicken and egg proposition here that since the biggest concentration of jobs is already in this downtown, therefore it needs the transit. And since we're going to build the transit, therefore it needs a higher concentration of jobs, which I think is ultimately challengeable in terms of sustainability. That's my first point. My second point is that the pandemic, of course, has made this all very much up for grabs, because we don't know what the future of work is going to be and what degree of our work week is going to be consumed in going back and forth into a center city location. So that's another thing that's undercutting our whole strategy around transit. I'm very pleased to see the 5 and 10 and 15-minute city trend, but that assumes that we would be moving away from this heavy dependence on hub and spoke transit systems that are enormously expensive, and consequent to their expenses means that you don't have money to support the more fine-grained network system, which I think a lot of theorists in my line of work are starting to try to advance publicly in our academic work and in our public responses. But unfortunately, I think our Canadian cities are still insisting on a hub and spoke system. I've mentioned Vancouver. It's also true in Calgary. It's also true in Montreal with their new REM system, which it entirely is intended to connect the suburban regions with the downtown on this presumption. I'll kind of end with, the only exception to this was the Transit City proposal for Toronto, which unfortunately has struggled mightily over the decades. But that was a network-based idea that was probably infinitely expandable had they built it out. Unfortunately, with the ascendance of Rob Ford to the mayoralty and the change in politics in Ontario, they've decided to, instead of doing the Transit City largely, to, at great expense, expand the Bloor-Danforth line with just a few stations. And this is the paradigmatic example of a bad transit decision, in my view. And then finally, on housing, I'm one of those who thinks that the best transit system is an affordable housing system. Right now, using Vancouver as the example again, a lot of housing decisions are made because people can't afford to live in the city of Vancouver, which has the highest concentration of jobs. And it's particularly service workers who are necessary to keep our local economy running their lifestyle is compromised because they can't afford to live close to home. It would be much cheaper, our analysis says, to spend the billions of dollars on ensuring that people could afford to live close to work than to do what we're doing now, which is to spend those billions of dollars on infrastructure to get them from the distant suburbs into the downtown. I think it's time we start thinking of housing as infrastructure. Right now, we don't think of housing as infrastructure. Right now, we only think of subways and highways as infrastructure. It's time to change that.
Well, thanks. That's a really interesting point about the essential workers. I mean, one could certainly make the argument that there's a certain irony, if not hypocrisy, in people banging their pots and pans and clapping on their front porches for essential workers, and then kind of shrugging as if, well, what are you going to do when those same essential workers get on 3 buses and take 2 hours to commute to work in the morning? Right. I don't know the answer to that, but I think some of your points there to get us in the right direction. So thank you. I want to stick with that theme, though, of the sort of the pipe to downtown, because Carla, that of course brings us to Metrolinx, which to a large extent historically has been focused on bringing people into the central core, into the business district of Toronto, which doesn't have very many people working in it right now. Now, obviously, before the pandemic, Metrolinx was working towards 15-minute service, was working towards electrification. That when they come along could change that model to some degree. Tell us a little bit about how much that would change that model and what that would mean for the region as Metrolinx progresses to that vision or that future.
Well, when I said at the top we were rewiring the region, I think that that really speaks to this idea of, in our previous speaker around creating this connective tissue within municipalities, within the region, so that there isn't this sole dependency on, hub and spoke only coming into the city. And I think that, to your point around what do we do about it, I would say that we're already looking at those options. We're already understanding how the travel patterns are changing and how we can provide the most amount of travel solutions and integrated travel solutions to meet that need. I would be remiss to say that we cannot get there on one solution alone. There are a lot of factors that feed into this, and are working with our municipal partners in a very close way and really creating those points of integration, understanding where we now have transit hubs and where we need to connect in with the bus services, the light rail transit, and really looking at the network holistically and creating those, as we say, those interconnection points to make sure that we have as much flexibility for how people need to move around the system throughout different parts of the day and to deliver on different kinds of activities.
Excellent, thank you. And something I want to go back to both Patrick and Michael. You talked a little bit about this, and so maybe both of you could answer this. We talked about building near stations, and that's always a popular topic. And to some extent, it can address the first mile, last mile issue. And people who are watching this probably know what that is, but that's basically that small but very crucial part at the beginning and end of your journey, which isn't carried by transit, or isn't necessarily carried by transit, but is still necessary to get you where you're going. Is sort of transit-oriented development, Michael, a way in part to get around the first mile problem, or is it solve it only for people who live there, but obviously you still have that problem for everyone else? I mean, is that a corollary solution to transit-oriented development, or is that very much a separate thing to your mind?
Thanks for taking us down this path, Oliver. No, I think transit-oriented development is absolutely a huge part of it's a part of the housing puzzle. It's a part of the transport puzzle. It's a part of the 15-minute city and creating these integrated livable communities. I know some of the other panels have talked about 15-minute cities as well. I think, and Ontario in particular has made huge strides in the transit-oriented development space. I think we're still working out some of the bugs, but the foundation that has been built by many of the projects that are in the pipeline create huge opportunity for, next ring, if I can say that kind of growth. And that's not the development that is immediately right next to the transit station, but because the municipality and Metrolinx and the development community working together can then stitch together multiple master plans or multiple projects together and effectively create, these nodes of activity. And ideally they're mixed use, right? You've got work, you've got housing occurring there, you've got amenities, you've got convenience things like everyday shopping, daycare, libraries. But the key thing is it's interesting. Carla was talking about the big bones and rewiring the region. But if we go down into a local sort of TOD scale, you then get into this question of, okay, well, how do you make sure that the walking and the cycling networks are properly set up to serve the transit stations, so the transit hub in turn can serve and support the two-way all day direction and ridership. While we're on TOD, I want to go back to one thing, and that maybe reflects on what Carla was talking about. Even though the GO network, you might look at a map and say, oh, it's so focused on Union Station. I think given the level of congestion and the level of trip density across the Toronto area, I have this conversation regularly with clients and other stakeholders multiple times a week. And you just have to recall, look at the trip times that will be achievable from different points of the region, not to Union Station, but to other parts of the region, even though those trips go via Union Station. I mean, 30, 40 years ago, when the region was building 4-inch series highways, and that became sort of the definition of how long does it take to get from A to B, you think about, well, I'll jump on the highway and go here. Well, that doesn't really work anymore because we have a region that is at a certain scale and it stops working on a totally auto-oriented model. So now you add the GO train network and the regional rail system, subways and regional rail, and you start defining trip times and connectivity on the future of this high frequency regional rail network. And that's what makes the accessibility for these transit-oriented nodes, these TODs, possible at a regional scale, because you can get there easily from lots of other places.
Anything you want to add to that, Patrick? I thought one thing that was interesting there, well, a lot of things are interesting there, but we're talking about transit fundamentally, but we shouldn't be talking just about transit. Sometimes the best trip is the one that someone doesn't take on a bus, someone takes on a bike share. Maybe someone walks. Mm-hmm. The idea of moving everyone to transit is great if it's moving from a congested road to a transit vehicle, but maybe transit isn't the be all and end all of transportation. What do you think, Patrick, about this idea that we need to focus on trips beyond just transit?
Yeah, as my gray hair attests, I'm old enough to have gone through a lot of different phases on the question of transit-oriented development. And having gone from wildly enthusiastic 20 years ago to skeptical now, I will just throw in the alternative statement that, having examined our own Vancouver region and done the mapping for a 10-minute walking distance to our current and future transit stations, that's only 5% of the region, and only about 8% of the total population of the region. And the other downside is that our experience here now suggests that when we build new housing infrastructure within that 10-minute circle, it tends to be less affordable than the housing that it has replaced. So those two issues have given me a lot of skepticism and moved me firmly in the direction of looking at a systemic approach that is homogeneous, that serves as equally as possible the entire region. Somehow it may be even somewhat slower than those fast trips on that heavy infrastructure system, but it is ubiquitous and serves all those areas without the kinds of economic and transportation distortions of a transit-oriented district approach. And that is why a network is necessary. And back to your point of your question, it's fascinating to look at European cities like Copenhagen and Amsterdam, for example, which have this characteristic of being a homogeneous density across very large-scale regions, districts, which include housing, commercial areas, and jobs. And in those kinds of areas, which I think we ought to be striving towards in our Canadian urban landscapes, it turns out that biking and walking as a share of all trips is a higher proportion than transit. But transit, biking, and walking form a constellation of mutually reinforcing types of trips that are only possible within a certain kind of neighborhood design, at a certain kind of density, at a certain level of affordable housing distribution, at a certain level of job availability within those districts.
You know, the joke always in urban planning is when people say, well, we're not Amsterdam, then you look at Amsterdam 30 years ago and say, well, they weren't Amsterdam then either. They've made a series of policy decisions to get where they are now. And it'd be interesting to see if any North American cities go down that same road, as it were. Carla, I want to ask you, actually, that sort of brings me to another question. A lot of cities have made net zero pledges, and it's easy to make a pledge like that. It's pretty hard to put it into practice. To what extent, we talked about go electrification a moment ago, to what extent should transit agencies be really leaning in on the net zero pledges as a way of making their case in a world where transit now kind of has to make its case because of the pandemic, and maybe it didn't have to make 2 or 3 years ago?
Great question. I was a little bit early on the previous panel, and I know that there was a lot of conversation about this, and I learned a lot just on the few minutes that I was there. I think, the net zero pledge is, sometimes it can be relegated to a bit of a catchphrase, right? And it's not really lived and embedded in the work that we do, and really kind of missing the goal or the aspiration. So I think what we take from that is the aspiration of sustainability, right? And that is totally built into our mandate for high quality of life, a sustainable environment, strong, prosperous, competitive economy. That is right in our regional transportation plan, our RTP. What we're doing right now on that respect is really embedding it into everything that we're doing. And while electrification through the GO expansion network is going to kind of take us leaps and bounds forward into, doing our part in getting to that pledge. We have other aspects around the bus service, for instance, and really looking at the bus strategy and how we move to electric buses and really kind of reducing that carbon footprint for that method as well. At the end of the day, the goals and the aspirations work, but it really has to become, as we said, like a little bit earlier, part of the policy, right? Part of how we do business, a commitment where we are looking at it, but also looking at it from the perspective of a business, because we do actually want to make sure that we are minimizing the cost of what we are doing to the taxpayer, but also providing a quality of life and a sustainable environment so that we are not filling the gaps and creating other problems in other areas. So to me, what I think about is really a system of choices, a system of goals and initiatives that really allow us to look at it from an economic perspective, an environmental perspective as well. And I take to heart in some of the words that we just talked about a little bit earlier around that first mile, last mile. Coincidentally enough, just this morning with my team, we were talking about our station access plan, which is really about shifting the modal split. So when I think about sustainability and when I think about those kinds of aspects about net zero, it's moving people out of their cars and looking at these other active transportation solutions that also help to inform achieving that goal and that aspiration. And it takes the system to be able to do that. So it's not just in one aspect. You want to look at the trains, you want to look at the buses, but it's how we all behave and how we incentivize and how we deliver all these various options to really deliver on that ultimate goal.
Yeah, and I think station access, that's a big one. I'll get back to that if we have time afterwards or later on. One thing that perhaps a question for all three of you, because we've talked a lot about transit, what it can do. And I don't think I need to talk to anyone in this panel or in this audience about what happens if transit doesn't work for a city. There aren't very many successful cities that don't have good transit. But that said, the last 2 years have shown fragility or a vulnerability of transit because of the revenue issue. Now, governments have come in, first the Safe Restart Agreement, and then the second one, and then a couple of weeks ago, Chrystia Freeland announced $750 million more. But there's a funding issue here. And to the extent that ridership doesn't come back or doesn't come back quickly enough, that starts to become a structural issue, a structural funding issue. To what extent does transit in Canada need a new funding model to put it on a more stable, predictable footing? Why don't you start, Michael?
Sure. You can have a whole panel discussion on just this topic, but I'll keep it relatively short. I think at its base, transit is it's a service that people depend on. It creates all kinds of additional benefits that go beyond just the fare that people pay, and those benefits are recognized by governments, and that's why governments spend a lot of money to build new capital and then to operate it. I think ensuring that the transit that is built and the way it's operated is generating benefits it is proven out if you have advertisers or riders or other partners, other third coming in and contributing money to the system. I think that's good. And you see in large successful city regions, they do a good job of leveraging the benefits of the system to generate some incremental revenues. But at the core of it, the benefits of a solid transit system to a city region are so great. That is the role of governments, and that's why governments will continue and need to provide the core base foundational capital funding and also a solid base of operating funding. But I think if you can get those other parties to also contribute a little bit, I mean, that just builds momentum and trust and consensus that the system's going in the right way. It's being built, expanded in the right way, and it's also being operated in the right way.
What do you think, Patrick, about this?
Well, I'm going to be the contrarian again in this case, because I had hoped that the pandemic would provide an opportunity for our metropolitan regions to re-examine the capital spending plans for the next 10 or 15 or 20 years relative to transit. So far, I have not seen that be the case. If there was a moment when the change would be most appropriate, it is now, when the ridership is actually collapsing, when the issue of housing affordability is clearly a driver of transportation demands all over the region for what remains. It should have been this moment when we would move away from the 1960s version of a transit system, which is basically a hub and spoke system that assumes that everybody in the suburbs goes to sleep out there and everybody goes to work in the center of the city. None of those things are true, and they're even less true after the pandemic. So it would be my hope that this would be a moment when we could re-examine these tens of billions, if not scores of billions of dollar plans for a continuation of the same kinds of mistakes that we've made in the past, where we should have reversed ourselves. This should be the moment for that reversal and create a homogeneous system of transportation opportunity around the idea of a 15-minute city where jobs, affordable housing, and commercial services are more or less in balance. And during the same 30-year period we have, in order to get our greenhouse gas thing under control, we get our movement systems under control and our housing and work systems under control at the same time. Understand those as part of the system of a necessary sustainability strategy, which has an economic, transportation, and greenhouse gas dimension. I think we should start Monday.
Well, I'll let you weigh in there, Carla, as a senior executive for an agency who's doing some of the projects that Patrick is just suggesting maybe shouldn't happen. Do you have a counterpoint?
Well, I think what I heard is not that it shouldn't happen, but it needs to happen in a systematic way. It needs to be balanced, and we need to be connected. And I think that that's something that we want as well, and that we are working towards. I would offer that, the infrastructure on a page may look hub and spoke, but when you dig into the actual service application and how it's being served and how it's being used, we are moving exactly in that direction around really understanding we work in a different way. We live in a different way. We want to go different places. And the center of the city is not always the nucleus from which we are working for. So I would offer that I think our objective is the same. I would say that from a transit agency perspective and delivering on our mandate and our responsibilities of giving the right transit advice to the decision makers and the funders to be able to prioritize that work, our business case is a place where we will start to adapt, and we have started to adapt that thinking. So we bring in different considerations, right? And so it's not just looking about the service patterns and the infrastructure needed, but there are other sensitivities around the socio and economic impacts to the project that are happening, the enablers, and working with other community partners or municipal partners, even municipal agencies, right? We talked about the TOD program a little bit earlier, looking at non-fare solutions. The heart of innovation here is where we're able to kind of put all these pieces together, and each doing our part and our center of expertise will be able to kind of deliver on that balanced network that was just talked about.
The audience members has thrown in a question, which is going to be on the controversial side, but I think it's a very good one to talk about. The question is whether Canadian cities should consider vehicle bans in their cores the way some European cities have done. And I would maybe qualify that a bit. My understanding is that those are car light areas in cities where residents can still use them, emergency vehicles can still get in, but to a large extent, general traffic by vehicle is not allowed in those areas. Is that something that should be used in Canada, whether from a straight up environmental point of view, or as an inducement to transit, or some combination of the two? Patrick, why don't we start with you?
Yeah. I'll jump in. I think I forget whether it was King Street or Queen Street in Toronto is a really good example of that. I'll just put that out there, where cars can get in, but their access is limited appropriately, and transit is given a larger share of the right of way, as well as biking and pedestrians. I think that model is very suitable for adaptation in North American cities. North American cities really lend themselves to that kind of strategy because of their gridded nature and the concentration of land uses that we already have. So that's something we could do again on Monday.
A lot to do on Monday. What do you think, Michael?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think pedestrianization of central cores is a really interesting concept. I know it's been tried in some places like Yonge Street in Toronto. I think it was in the 70s or the 80s. It was an experiment. It was decided that it didn't quite work, but our cities are a lot bigger. I mean, there's lots of space to try these things out. And I'd like to see more aggressive application of some of these. They can be used as pilots. I mean, look at how successful the cycling lane pilots have been in the city of Toronto. I mean, you provide the infrastructure in areas where there is the potential for people to walk and cycle more. They will use it, and to do it safely. So I'm in favor of it, but I think you have to be careful. It's a case-by-case basis. You got to be talking with your BIA, your local councils. I mean, it's messy and difficult, but I'm all for it. But I'm not gonna say across the board it's the right answer in every case.
And certainly, I've been in cities elsewhere in the world where the pedestrian areas are kind of tourist tat. They're not necessarily areas where you want to live in if you're a local. What do you think about the idea, Carla?
Well, what came to mind is this concept of a walkable city. And I think I lean on some of the examples that we had before. I think it's a good idea. But it needs to be case by case. I think that sometimes changing people's habits and people's behaviors is the toughest part of all of the solution. And so when we do it, we've got to make sure it's connected, that there are alternate options that are viable, and that people feel safe in doing so. I just take a little bit of a hint from in COVID when we couldn't sit indoors for an early part of our experience there, and there were a lot of street sidewalks taking up space so that people could expand their reach and sit outside and have a meal because we were trying not to be indoors. And I feel that is part of that extension of that understanding of being in this more of a walkable, open kind of city. I think people want it, but we also take into consideration weather and all these other aspects. So I agree with Michael. It's case by case, but I'm for it as well.
Excellent, thanks. Actually, I'm going to stay with you, Carla, because there's an audience question, which I kind of love, because I've thought about it, but I haven't put my brain really to work on it. If we move towards a hybrid work model, the kind we have now, over time, we will probably center or coalesce on certain days we're going to work and certain days we're not. And whether we do that as a society, we do that individually as companies, will make a big difference to transit. I mean, for example, if everyone who has an office job is working 3 days a week, but generally are working Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, we still need full capacity on those days. We effectively need weekday capacity 3 days a week and weekend capacity 4 days a week. To what extent does that make it harder to meet the needs of a hybrid society when, in theory, people are using transit less, but actually on any given day, they might be using transit an awful lot? And to what extent do sort of governments and companies, should they try to smooth that out and make it more even?
That's a good question. That's a little bit of a, do you build it and they come, chicken and an egg kind of situation, or the reverse? For our experience right now, I would say we want to be as adaptive to how companies need to work and how people want to work, not the reverse and put something out there and hope. So the flexibility, and I talked about that a little bit at the top though, the flexibility is the key here, to really be responsive to the needs of customers, to the needs of transit riders in the region. And I don't know if we're in a world right now, if I'm being completely candid, are we in a world right now where we can dictate that? It is an employer's market, as we've seen, and employees are actually making demands and decisions around how they want to work and where they want to work and the times in which that happens. And I think that we're in a position right now where we have to adapt. And I think that we're ready to do that. I think we've proven as a society that we can. Another learning coming out of COVID. So I don't think there's any one solution. We can't predict the future completely, but I think it's all about flexibility and adapting. And our 15-minute service and really creating those connective tissues and taking the time now to build up those options and that sense of resilience in the system is going to allow us to really meet the need.
We're just about out of time, so I'm going to give the last word to Patrick here. Just to give final thoughts. You've been a bit of the contrarian today, and I'm really glad you're here with that because it's great to have the contrary view. Any last thoughts on the panel? Anything you want the audience to take away with them?
Yeah, no, it's a great panel, and I appreciate the comments of my esteemed colleagues. And for the sake of argument, I guess I've been a little bit negative, but just to reinforce the idea that we do have a moment here where we can reconsider the trends of our metropolitan development and combine our ideas of transportation need with an idea about housing affordability, with an idea about complete communities that are within a 15-minute circle, part of a metropolitan region, but very much for their day-to-day needs, getting to work and back, their commercial needs, their recreational needs, can live within this smaller energy confined area. And there are plenty of global examples that show that can be done. And I would hope that our transportation decisions would be married with a much more insightful and systemic view of the future of our metropolitan regions that comports our vision of those regions with economic, social, and ecological sustainability. That's basically what I've been arguing for here today.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Patrick. And thank you, Michael. And thank you, Carla, for your excellent contributions. And thanks to the audience for tuning in. That's all the time we have now. We go next to Adrian Lee, who's moderating the next panel. And enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thanks, Oliver. And hi, everyone. Welcome to your final panel discussion of the day. I'm Adrian Lee. an editor for the opinion section of the Globe and Mail. I'm also I'm actually the host of the City Space podcast at the Globe, where we look at various aspects around the future of cities. And we're about to embark on our second season in the next couple months, so this is well timed. One of the first episodes we did on that show was tackling the idea of the 15-minute city, the 15-minute neighborhood. And you've heard that phrase come up a fair bit, I believe, over the course of this day. The concept is simple enough. A neighborhood where everything a person could need is no more than a 15-minute walk or bike ride away. And that's probably why so many cities, from Paris and Milan to Edmonton and Newmarket, Ontario, have made it a part of their future design visions. And it seems like a good idea for climate change, too, to shape our cities in a way that really reduces carbon emissions from the question of mobility. But what does this mean for the future of transportation, for the brick and concrete cities that already exist, and maybe most importantly, for the people who actually live in them already? Is this question, is the 15-minute city really viable across Canada, or is this doomed to be just another urban design and city planning buzzword? I'm looking forward to hearing from our speakers on this, so let's introduce them now. First, we have Emily Reisman. She's a partner at Urban Strategies, Inc., a global urban design and planning consultancy headquartered in Toronto. Next, we have Darnell Harris. He's the founder and executive director of Our Greenway, a conservancy focused on nurturing community-centered equitable mobility in Northwest Toronto. And finally, Lon Leclerc. He's the general manager of engineering services with the city of Vancouver. Thanks for joining us today, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Thanks for having us.
Let's get started.
Thank you.
And maybe we'll get started with Emily. So as someone who thinks of city planning from sort of a higher level strategic approach, can you tell us a bit more about the 15-minute city or 15-minute neighborhood and how exactly it has captured the imaginations of so many planners right now?
Sure. I mean, when I think about it, the first thing that comes to mind for me is that it's not a new idea. It's got a catchy name and a sexy champion in the city of Paris, but planners have long recognized the challenges that that came from our previous good intentions around planning when we tried to manage the automobile and embrace all of the wonderful things that were supposed to come with it. And so in trying to recognize the challenges, we've tried other things and they've come under other names. The New Urbanist movement was recalled in one of the other panels earlier today. We've gone through smart growth in Ontario and other places. We talk about complete communities. And there are nuances, of course, to each of these things with greater emphasis in one category or another, but they all strive for forms of compact growth that in one way or another are aiming to reduce reliance on automobiles while perhaps achieving other things depending on which of those different elements you're looking at. And so in the addition to the attractiveness, perhaps, of it coming from Paris, there's also this idea that it's easily relatable. And at a personal level, we can understand what it means to take a 15-minute bike ride or to go for a 15-minute walk. And that's a lot easier for any of us, the general public. You know, my parents, I always test out my theories on them to see if they can come along with me for the journey, if it makes any sense. And they get that, you know, they know how far they can go in 15 minutes, more so than if I start to talk about complete communities or new urbanism or any of these other planning ideas. So between that catchy phrase that actually relates is much more relatable, that also came along at a time when I think there was a greater groundswell in our collective discourse around the issues of climate change, an increased imperative to address equity and affordability in our cities and our communities, and a general consciousness that all of these things are coming together so that we understand collectively that what we build, how we build it, and where we build it matters when we're looking for solutions. But again, and I don't think it's really anything new.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're actually, speaking of new, you're working on a new development that might incorporate that concept a bit, right? Can you tell us a bit about the Downsview development?
Oh, sure. This is very exciting. It's one of those things that comes along once in a lifetime as a planner. So I'm incredibly honored to be working on this. In the middle of the city of Toronto, in the heart of the GTA, you know, one of the most populous parts of our country, there sits a site of about 500 acres, the home of the Downsview airstrip where Bombardier is currently operating. But they will be vacating the site by the end of 2023. And it itself is part of a larger site that was once the Canadian Forces Base Downsview that had been surplus by the federal government some decades ago. that is now available for us to think about planning a new piece of city in the city of Toronto. And what's particularly exciting and unique about this site is not only its incredible scale, it's, top to bottom about the same size as downtown. For those who are familiar with downtown Toronto, it's about walking from Bloor Street to Front Street from north to south, but also that it already has transit connectivity. It has a GO station that provides 20-minute direct service right down to Union Station, as well as 3 subway stations on the Yonge University line. And those stations are surrounded by essentially vacant land. So we can write the story that we want to write on this site, which is something that most places across the country and in other North American cities don't have the ability to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to go to Lon next, just because, Lon, you work in the city of Vancouver. The story, in some ways, has been a little bit written. The city of Vancouver is as it is. How are you putting the 15-minute city approach into play in Vancouver?
Well, first of all, I love the discussion, and I like the way, Emily, you talked about the different ways that we call it. For my time here at the city, just before I became the general manager of engineering services, I've been in transportation for 24 years, and I've been involved in a number of creation of plans, transportation plans, land use plans, climate emergency action plan, and most recently here at the city. But what's interesting to me is the way that we called it, or what we were trying to do at the various stages of my time here at the city. So at the beginning, the focus was very much about transit-oriented development and journey to work. And I always thought that was a bit odd, because I was thinking it suggests that you want to take transit to go everywhere, which doesn't seem to design a good city. And then when you think about the journey to work, half the population doesn't even work. Surprise, surprise. Like they're too young, or they're too old, or they choose not to work because they have other things they want to do. But so I always thought it had to be pedestrian-oriented development, that the neighborhood had to be pedestrian-oriented. And in fact, that would support transit, because then if you create places that when you get there, a car feels odd to have, or it's more of a burden than a benefit, then you think about trying to get there without one. So whether it's a destination here or there or anywhere in the region, and even a different city or a different region, if you can imagine yourself kind of living there without that. So how it's manifest most recently, so is the Climate Emergency Action Plan, which Council just approved last fall, has 6 big moves. Big move number 1 is the walkable city. And it basically describes it differently, because it says 90% of your daily needs are within an easy walk or roll. So that's the goal. So that's very different, because it actually doesn't care about your journey to work, because a lot of your trips, like if you look at trip making, only a third of your trips go to work, even if you do work. So if you capture all the other trips, the laundry or your haircuts or all those other reasons you're getting out there, if those are on foot or bike, we've actually achieved a lot more. And then the other one that's kind of coming at us right now at the regional level, which is also a really nice fit, is the Transport 2050 plan, because it has 2 big premises. The first one is that short trips, the best way to do them is by walk or roll. So walk and bike is your first choice for all trips that are not long. And then for long trips, transit's your first choice. And for transit to be attractive for that long trip, it has to be travel time competitive with driving. So that's a different way of thinking about how we're planning for transit. It basically says, make the long trips on transit very time efficient and competitive with driving, and make the short trips really attractive to walk or bike.
That's great. And Darnell, in some ways, from my understanding, you've kind of been doing the groundwork for 15-minute neighborhoods and 15-minute cities for some time now, just in Toronto. Can you tell us a bit about your work at Our Greenway and how that relates to what we're talking about today?
So Our Greenway is a nonprofit that's been working in Toronto, but as well as across Canada, focusing on cargo cycle challenges and e-cycle challenges, and specifically looking at the question of how people are able to access them, are looking in Toronto specifically at trying to provide a conservancy, because the challenge that we have, and speaking of Downsview, certainly our start within that area, asking the questions, how do we have the infrastructure that we need? There are a number of places that do not have, access to the type of mobility devices they would need, certainly, as well as, questions about sort of the maintenance of infrastructure. For example, there is the 400 highway. It was built 50 years ago. There's no bridge across. There's challenges getting from one side to another and sort of dealing with those questions. And the 15-minute city, especially, when it's been implemented and thought of as a concept, generally it's been focused almost entirely on the cores of cities in a place where, things are not necessarily produced. And when you deal with that in an industrial neighborhood, there are questions from an equity perspective of what does that mean within a larger scale, and how are people going to have the tools they need to be able to move around with that space.
Right. So your argument would be that the 15-minute city might not necessarily fit the template for every lived experience and every lived environment. Is that right?
Exactly. Certainly within the 15-minute city, there are, in questions of one, you need to plan at the hyper local level, but also there's, to us, a question of timing, both from equity perspective and how long it takes to build or rebuild, but also, frankly, from a climate budget perspective, in that there are questions of embodied carbon. And, if we're looking at rebuilding things, for example, we're looking at releasing more carbon in doing so if we are demolishing a building completely. When we speak about raw materials, that's also questions of equity. And so, from the perspective we've learned during this pandemic, it's much easier for us to change our streets and how we move than it is to rebuild communities and build new communities on the timescales that we're usually dealing with.
And so maybe we'll go back quickly to Lon. Was that something that you sort of experienced as you've worked toward that 15-minute neighborhood process over the last 2 or 3 years?
In terms of the road space reallocation,
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, the pandemic has been a real amazing learning opportunity for us. I mean, there's always been, I guess, there's a political support at the city to reallocate road space for walking and cycling, and it's always been a pretty big battle. Though, like a lot of businesses are very resistant to see road space reallocated to people walking or parks or plazas and things like that, and so. Over my time here, it took 20 years to get, 2 plazas, a block of Robson and a block of Butte off of Davie Village. And then the pandemic hits and suddenly we have 20 plazas. Now, broadly supported by all the businesses, they realize the importance of people being able to sit and meet each other outside. Same with the patios. We had a patio program so that you could reallocate a couple of parking spaces for extra seating for your restaurant. We only had about 2-3 of them before the pandemic. And then 2020 hit, and then we had 400, and then 500, now 600, now 800. It's kind of surprising how the businesses, as soon as they see it in action and they see that one parking space could be used for 12 customers, I think that they understand that there's an economics that's different than what their assumption was. So yeah, this has been an exciting time for the cycling piece. Again, similar to Toronto, we did a lot of road space reallocation for cycling just to give people room to walk and bike in the city, and those have all been really well received.
Mm-hmm. But then a bit to Darnell's point, we have communities that sort of understand the economics of, the climate change piece. We have communities that understand that there are, as you say, Lon, aspects that make total sense sort of on a broader societal level for redesigning our cities. But they're also, those are often the same communities that aren't necessarily ready in terms of the mobility available, in terms of the infrastructure available to make that change in a way that doesn't cost them in their day-to-day life in the way that they are currently living. Have you come up against that in the course of your work in Vancouver?
Well, again, if we're talking about the cost to the residents or the individuals, because the city has a lot of ability to quickly adapt road space, and then again, this is what the pandemic taught us: is that a couple of gravity barriers and some cones, and suddenly what was a terrible or not so enjoyable street to walk or bike on is suddenly quite a bit improved, and so. For people who have low incomes or are living in poverty, walking is how they get around anyways. We have a couple programs that have been really successful in terms of supporting people with low income on our bike share system in partnership with Van City. So they pay pretty much the whole membership except for $20, and you can see how much they use that system. And so to the extent that we make getting places easier, and we have the kind of discount or zero cost bike share program available to them, this actually can be life-changing for a lot of people.
And Emily, can you speak a bit to Darnell's point just around the idea of designing a city or designing a development that is bigger, applying those 15-minute principles in a situation where, if it's sort of exurban, suburban situation versus what already exists in a denser city?
Absolutely. And I think that your question points to a big and important point that Darnell hit on, that the idea of the 15-minute city, that this as a conceptual planning approach, is not a one-size-fits-all approach. There is no set definition about how it should be applied, and certainly no set way that it could uniformly be applied to an existing urban area, a suburban area, or a brand new city, to be developed like we have at Downsview. Nor the range of interventions would necessarily be the same or necessary in each case. So it's important to think about how to bring not only the policymakers in for establishing these things, but communities in to help define what makes sense in that local context. It might be about, as Darnell mentioned, about making critical links that have been missing in the infrastructure so you actually have true mobility choice. In other places, it might be about revitalizing access to certain jobs or housing things to make sure that people have access to these basic elements. Or in other places, it could be about revitalizing historic downtowns and main streets to provide the shops and services that then fill those gaps. So it's, as much as we say that there's it's got a planning theory with a great title, one of the benefits perhaps is that it's not well defined, and rather it's this collective goal that means we all want to have lots of ways to move around and actually have choice. And perhaps our previous ways of planning did not allow for that choice and presuppose certain ways of doing things that may not have been appropriate or equitable across our cities. In Downsview, one of the benefits, as I mentioned, we have is space, and we have existing transit. And I think that the role of transit is also really important in evaluating these ideas where it's available and where it's practical, so that if you're meeting basic needs in a local area through a wide variety of mobility options and you're making those things attractive, you also recognize that you don't want to create islands. Communities need to be able to come together. You need to be able to go out of your bubble, as we've learned in the last 2 years, to get that kind of intellectual stimulation and to meet other people. And that's where great ideas come and happen. So transit provides the opportunity to have a convenient way to go those longer distances, as long described, and thinking of the short distance and the long distance. So, transit and access to it is a really important part of how we think about implementing the promise of the 15-minute city.
Mm-hmm. We have a very related audience question here. So from a mobilities perspective, there seems to be many mobility and environmental benefits of the 15-minute city. However, how do we avoid then, practically speaking, the risk of closed community or increased inequity, as you've sort of spoken about, both Darnell and Emily?
I think it starts with talking to communities and understanding what their concerns and risks may be. There are lots of examples, even in pre-war planning, of where communities really did function on a kind of, what we would say 15-minute scale now, the old streetcar suburbs. But then new phrases or new popularities in planning, like the expressway systems, may have come in and obliterated the ability of those communities to function as they were intended. And so we have to use our hindsight and to make sure that we are connecting with the communities we're working in when we come with these new ideas, to make sure that they can be applied on the ground in a way that doesn't have those unintended consequences.
And Darnell, does that resonate with you?
It does. And also what I would answer here is choice is only a choice if you are provided that choice. So, for example, people can take transit because that transit is being provided on a regular basis. The choice to bike is often not a choice for many people for two reasons. Either because they don't have the type of bike that would actually meet their needs, as well as the question of where they live and the safety about that choice. Many of the sort of cafe parklets, for example, and that sort of discussion were only ever implemented in the core of cities within those spaces. Whereas in arterial roads and suburbs, you have plenty of ample space on the side of the road if the proper infrastructure was implemented. And so one of the reasons that our Greenway has established a cargo bike library with a number of different cargo bikes, all electric assist for seniors, for industry, as well as for families, is to be able to show there are options. But certainly the challenge that we've come up with in establishing this cargo cycle library is there aren't options for many people because we don't make them here in Canada. They're too expensive. Access is a challenge. And so, it's difficult for people, especially low-income people, because it's often not a choice they can do to walk if they live in the suburbs, which is frankly where they're increasingly living as affordability is pushing them out of the core.
Right. And I want to here refer to something that Toronto placemaker Jay Pitter said in the episode of City Space, which is in talking about the 15-minute city, something to think about is, whose 15 minutes are we talking about? The 15-minute that I may have, the 15-minute walk or bike ride that I may have in the middle of downtown and downtown Toronto is going to look different, Darnell, I think, than the 15 minutes that folks are going to have in suburban communities or ex-urban communities. And so, what does that mean for you? The question of who's 15 minutes specifically, Darnell, and what do you think needs to change to make folks understand that a little bit?
Certainly, I think there are two tracks. One, focusing on local mobility, focusing on point A to B by providing people with the micromobility devices that they would need to be able to get around, and making a conscious effort to produce them and look after the ecosystem that supports that. It's possible for people to drive cars because no matter where you are, you can be certain there is repair assistance nearby, there are parts, there is availability of that. None of that is certainly there for micromobility. So that would be one piece. And the second would be, to look at, of course, what Sweden has been doing, as well as what Jay has mentioned, plan within the hyperlocal and look at what changes can be made within the time scales that we have with a focus on reusing the spaces that we already have, and how do we adapt them in a sensible way.
Lon, just going to you, we've talked a little bit about examples of porting the 15-minute city onto places that don't necessarily have that approach right now. But are there examples that you can point to that sort of do exist already? Neighborhoods or communities that are set up for this kind of walkability, this kind of micromobility that you could point to?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that what's interesting is that for us, the task ahead of us, both in terms of responding to that big move, number one, in climate emergency, or with our new city plan that we're trying to come up with, is actually tackling those areas that aren't really 15-minute areas right now. Like, in fact, that is the task. The downtown and the metro core is functioning fine in terms of, everything can be reached pretty easily within 15 minutes. So, fortunately in the city of Vancouver, outside of the metropolitan core, we probably have 20 really good, vibrant little neighborhood cores. But there's other areas that are kind of a little bit too far from those cores to actually benefit from them. And so it's really about looking at the voids in our city where if you live there, it's very unlikely you'll kind of walk role to most of your needs, and how do we fix that? And it's two pieces. Like the easiest thing to do is look at, is there barriers in the transportation system that's stopping you from making those choices, like missing sidewalks or a busy street you can't cross, or cycling, finding a place to do the bike. The longer term solution is the land use piece, which of course is delivering those services close to the places. And this is a retrofit that's required in a lot of our single family areas where all there is housing. And you can walk for 5 more minutes and there's just more housing, and walk for 5 more minutes, there's more housing. That's not helpful because those aren't destinations. I mean, you might have a friend there. And similarly for our mono, kind of like industrial areas too. And so for those people who, make their way to an industrial area and their job is there, and then, it's lunch hour, can I get any tasks done? Is there a drugstore to pick up that thing, or like go to a different place for lunch, or, do anything. And again, I think there's a retrofit opportunity for us in job centers where they don't have daily needs like in close proximity. So that's the big task ahead of us. And like I say, it's land use, takes longer. It's unfortunately, it takes years to get a building built or a purpose, a use repurposed. But the immediacy of the transportation investments are there. And I do kind of want to mention the cycling one is an interesting one. The more that, I was really surprised at how big the uptake was on our bike share system for people with low income. And basically, they in Van City was put out a couple hundred passes. When they got used up, we said, okay, we used them all up. They said, well, here's another couple hundred. They were totally wanting to support the community. And we can tell by the usage of our membership how much use those are getting. And I only say that because it is surprising how far you can get in 15 minutes on a bike. If there's a good bike network, holy smokes, that your world just went from, this kind of walking radius to this. And often the bike trip is, oddly enough, faster than both driving and transit, depending on the time of day.
Mm-hmm. I want to get at something you mentioned there, Lon, and I'll ask the group. And this ties into a couple audience questions we've received, which is something when we talk about the 15-minute city is about having the services that you need nearby. And a big part of that is going to be zoning and ensuring that retail is available where it needs to be, which is to say you have a pharmacy near X, you have a library near X, a school. I mean, there's not necessarily, company retail zoning, but it's part of it. But then the other part of it is, big box stores are drivers, especially in suburban and exurban communities for, driving. How do folks see that playing out as 15-minute cities and neighborhood planning approaches come to communities where you can ensure that retail is where it needs to be to make that all possible?
I mean, again, maybe our context is a little bit different in Vancouver, but I never had too much concern about the big box retail. I mean, our Costco is right at a SkyTrain station. I know lots of people who use SkyTrain to go to Costco. Right where I work here is a Canadian Tire, a Save-On Foods, a Home Depot. These are traditionally big box, and they're going to be right at the crossroads of 2 rapid transit lines and in the middle of a big area where lots of people can walk to it. So I've never had a concern about that. The bigger challenge is getting commercial space in predominantly all residential or all industrial. And when commercial space there is often not on anyone's radar because there is, you need a tenant. And the tenant, the tenant has got to be something we just got to hope that will come up, because in fact, it's going to be local serving. And that's the purpose of it. So this is not destination shopping that we need to have to achieve the 15-minute city outside of our already successful areas of the city. We just need local services. And so in that case, we just have to make sure there's enough body heat, just enough people. So this comes with, again, increasing the density across the single family areas in a way that can support a local serving service of any type. And I try to be general about services because, yes, it's shops. For sure it is that sell things, but services are, the chiropractic or the dentist or, the accountant or the people get their nails done. People need to get their dry cleaning done. These are all the really not glamorous retail, local serving retail that needs to be there if we're going to get to that target of 90% of all your daily needs. It's a lot of things, but they're not broadly serving the city as a whole. They're actually just targeted at the very local area. And there's got to be one of them everywhere.
Darnell, are you seeing that a little bit and where you're working there as far as how retail is driving what's possible?
Certainly retail drives a lot of what's possible in Downsview and within the Northwest. Most of the commercial areas are either at the core of two major arterial roads or along one of the other arterial roads. And so while retail does in fact drive what's possible, a lot of the solutions that can be implemented in our single family area communities, as well as in those places, really come down to the type of mobility devices that you actually have access to. Because most people look, for example, at a bike share bike. A bike share bike is great at getting you around, but it will not be very good at getting your groceries around, for example, especially if you happen to have a larger family. So being able to have the type of cargo bikes that can carry several hundred kilograms, for example, which is some of the bikes that we have, opens up a different mindset. You only need to drive with the idea that, I need to put some multiple bags in the trunk. If you are suddenly freed from that need because you have access to a different type of tool, then different possibilities open up.
Mm-hmm. And Emily, I just wanted to put, sorry, Darnell, did I interrupt you?
No, it's okay. Emily?
No, Emily, I just wanted to put a question that the audience has been interested in, which is specifically around the question of schools, the placement of schools, and the sort of car dependency that a lot of pickup and drop-off situations around schools poses. Is this something that you've considered as part of the your Downsview planning approach?
Yes, and just to connect the dots between all these questions, I think what Bear's kind of stating here is that there are a variety of actors that play a role in achieving these goals that we broadly set out around the ability to have a lot of your daily needs met with mobility choice close to home. And of course, that involves the policymakers, planners, folks like Lon and I, and community members and other folks like Darnell sort of bringing new ideas to the table, and also communities sort of helping to guide what needs are appropriate to be met in any location. And that means that there's also a role for the private sector and the development community, and there's a role for governments at various levels. So coming to the schools question in particular, at Downsview and many places across the city where I work, we hear about the need for schools all the time. And so often, as much as local retail is part of connecting people to a place, it's the school that connects people to a place. And at least in Ontario, the planning framework allows for us to plan for schools and to, at the municipal level, identify school sites, but without boring the audience, getting the school built and ready in time for a new community to grow up around it becomes a big part of the challenge. And that's because some of the funding models and the mandates of different organizations don't necessarily align with some of our planning and policy goals. And so that's something that's really on my mind as a planner, is how to make those connections better because of the important role that schools play in helping to create communities, especially as we're trying to encourage families that, a single family home isn't the only way to grow up. I'm sitting in my apartment here where I'm raising my kid. You can see some of the Lego behind me, but we have a school in the neighborhood, which is part of why it's easy for us to be here and why we chose to locate there. The issue around pickup and drop off is another sort of symptom of this bigger question that's before us right now. If schools are located in communities, if there are safe access routes to the schools, folks should be able to feel comfortable walking with their kids to school. But maybe that's not the issue. Maybe it's the issue that the nature of the work that the caregivers are employed in requires them to not be available to walk their kids to school. They have to drive or take long transit trips or other ways to get to jobs that are further afield. And so I think we have to be sensitive to the different conditions and find ways to ease those things into communities, especially as schools start to be developed in denser areas. We're talking about podium schools and more urban formats as we find new ways to grow. But certainly schools are such great anchors for a community. They should often be, the number one thing we try to work around.
Yeah, we're just running out of time here. So, there's certainly a ton of little levers and little elements that you have to balance when we consider, city building, city planning, and ongoing efforts towards city designing a better one. And so I want to put it to the three of you, and you each sort of represent different stakeholders and stakes in the scheme of these things. The 15-minute city and the 15-minute neighborhood is designed to tackle very particular issues around cities. And so the question I want to pose to each of you is, what does success look like for each of you? What does success moving ahead in this world in which 15-minute neighborhoods and cities could be a norm? What does success look like? Maybe we'll start with Lon, and then Darnell, then Emily.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, the success means for me, I'm a very metrics-oriented person. So I would want to see that we're reaching those goals, those targets. And how you measure them is actually another challenging thing. I mean, we do our trip diary surveys annually for our residents, and so we can get a sense of how people have changed their the way they're getting around. It's hard to do it at a granular level, but there are other really great ways to measure it. Like even simple things like walk score and bike score are a really good indication of how well we're doing. And I think that we can kind of turn to those a little bit to see if we're making progress in the areas that we need to.
Okay. Darnell?
So for me, certainly one, that we have communities where the changes have been created through participatory planning and co-development, and have spaces in which people can feel welcome as well as comfortable. And an important part of that certainly is people have the tools they need, the right mobility tools, to be able to change the way they move through their community locally. Because ultimately, as important as moving is, people don't want to live next to a busy car artery. But if there are green, sustainable, quiet ways of getting around that still allow people to get around, such as, scooters and cargo bikes and e-bikes and such, then people and communities might find their neighbors are much happier about the idea of a cafe, for example, by which I mean a house turning into a cafe or a house turning into a chiropractor, for example, because they're not worried about suddenly having 20 cars sitting in front of their house.
Great. And last but not least, Emily.
I think success looks like choice. Choice for how you move around, choice for where you live, and that those choices are anchored by priorities that are defined by the communities that they affect.
That's great. And a perfect place to leave it, I think. Thank you, Emily and Darnell and Lon, for joining us today. And thank you to everyone in the audience for listening in and sharing your questions and comments throughout this whole summit. By the way, if you want to hear the Globe and Mail City Space podcast take on the 15-minute city, check that out and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. On behalf of the Globe and Mail, I would also like to recognize Toyota for supporting today's event. We will send out a link to the recorded webcast over the next couple of weeks. Thank you again.